everyone, and welcome back to the Cookie Crew. My name is Laura Chapa. Today we'll be doing the final installment of our history of civil rights in the United States of America. Today we will be talking about the 50s, 60s, 70s, and possibly the 80s and the 90s. To start off with, in the 50s. So there were numerous Supreme Court rulings in the 50s on civil rights. Brown versus Board of Education that disallowed only white and only black schools. Martin Luther King Jr. was a famous person in the 50s, civil rights leader. He was born in Atlanta, Georgia. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, most famous for his March on Washington, where 200,000 people stood on the Capitol Mall in front of the Lincoln Memorial, where they now have a plaque to commemorate him. His most famous speech was I Have a Dream speech, which was basically his belief that someday blacks and whites and Native Americans and Asians and Latin Americans, all peoples, would be able to live together in harmony and in peace. There was Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her bus seat for a white person. There was a case about that. And the Civil Rights Act of 1957 was one of the major civil rights acts that went through during the 50s and 60s. Basically, it made voting rights, civil rights violations, and voting rights enforcement critical, so that no one could stop an African American or person of color from voting. And it also kept criminal civil rights violations. It brought it down because then it made it illegal for these things to happen. It made lynching, it made enforcement of laws against lynching even more critical and even more powerful. In the 60s, there was the sit-in in Greensboro, North Carolina, where a bunch of African American and even white people went into an only white restaurant and decided to sit down. A lot of horrors happened because of that. People had cigarettes pushed onto their skin and were severely burned because of it. People had their hair torn out. People were beaten up. It was one of the many sit-ins that occurred across the country. There were the Freedom Riders who rode around the United States, basically it was a protest to end discrimination in public facilities. There was the incident at the University of Mississippi where James Meredith was denied entrance into the University of Mississippi, and then the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was created, making that illegal. He could no longer be denied access into the University of Mississippi. In the 60s, Cesar Chavez was active, working for immigrant farm workers, for Hispanic farm workers, so that they could get good health benefits and good pay for doing their work. There was the event with the KKK in the 16th Street Baptist Church, where 3 black girls were killed in a bombing by the KKK. And only 71-year-old Bobby Cherry was convicted of any kind of murder in 2002. There was the Selma to Montgomery Freedom March, where they marched across the bridge from Selma to Montgomery, and they were protesting discrimination. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 protected the voting rights of all peoples of color. There was the aforementioned March on Washington, which we mentioned in the 50s, but it occurred in the 60s, and it was basically to support peaceful attempts at integration, even though it was criticized by the NAACP. Malcolm X was a civil rights leader of the 1960s. He had converted to Islam, and he was a great supporter of Martin Luther King. There are many riots throughout the 60s because of these acts, because of these voting rights laws, and because of the really influential people. During the 70s, there was the affirmative action, which basically University of California, Davis, Alan Bakke had been denied entrance into the school because he was white, and they wanted to fill a quota, so that made quotas illegal. And that is a kind of, although affirmative action is supported by people of color, which is going to be the umbrella term for African Americans, Latin Americans, Native Americans, and Asians, it is sort of discriminatory against white people, and the courts ruled that it actually was extremely discriminatory to the point that it cannot be allowed. Affirmative action cannot exist. There was the Equal Rights Amendment, which failed the necessary state ratifications to be put in as an amendment to the Constitution, but it was a huge step in making equal rights for all people. Roe versus Wade was a women's thing back in the 70s about abortion, which is an example of civil rights that was going on not just for between races, but between men and women. In the 80s, there was the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act, which is again another example of civil rights for people, for not just between colored people and white people, but also for disabled people and mentally ill people. The affirmative action backlash happened in the 80s, where they tried, President Ronald Reagan tried to cut funding for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and that occurred in order to get rid of affirmative action. In the 90s, there was the African American matriculation, which basically means that more African Americans were becoming higher social class. They were moving from being like just the poor workers, the janitors, to movie stars, to business people, and there was a lot of backlash against that. They were called Tommies, which is a reference to Uncle Tom's Cabin. But it meant it was a signal of huge higher standing for the African American people. There were the 1992 Los Angeles riots, which had to deal with Rodney King being beaten just because he was African American. There were church burnings against black churches in the 90s. The Navajo Mountain Reservation was finally given all the land that had, not all of the land, but the land that had been promised to the Navajo people was finally given to the Navajo people, and that became part of the Navajo Mountain Reservation, which was an attempt at making up for the wrong that had been done during the colony's times, and even afterwards up to beyond President Andrew Jackson. So that is the end of the civil rights in U.S. history. We will be starting our civil rights in Mexico soon, after we take some time to do some other videos based on other topics. I hope you guys enjoy. I hope you guys had a great winter break, and I hope everyone has a happy new year. Bye.